You are standing at the precipice of a decision that will define your entire life. Not just yours, Rhino, but the lives of those who depend on you. The weight of it presses into your chest, like a storm cloud hanging low, threatening to burst. You can feel the sharp sting of judgment in the room, the silent sneer of superiority. Every moment of hesitation is another inch of ground lost, another victory snatched from your grasp. And there she was, Ophelia Jackson, tall and composed, walking into the boardroom with the soft grace of a person who has learned long ago that power is not always loud. It is often quiet, still and unyielding. She walked in with the calm of someone who had seen this before, who had felt the sting of eyes like daggers digging into her, but refused to let it define her. She knew that the true measure of a person wasn't in how many barriers they had to face, but in how they walked through them. The men sitting around the large, polished table all looked at her, first with curiosity, then with the unmistakable, unspoken condescension reserved for anyone who doesn't fit their mold. There was a flicker of surprise, yes, but mostly there was the calm assurance of entitlement. It was not the kind of room where a woman like Ophelia, black, dressed simply and not adorned with the expected trappings of wealth, should belong. Yet there she stood, as if the space had been built for her and only her. But the real attention shifted when Lucas Howard Cunno, the CEO of Terra Nova, leaned back in his chair. His eyes narrowed as he looked her up and down, with a practiced air of detachment. Lucas was a man who had spent decades building himself into an immovable pillar, perched at the top of a towering corporate empire. A man who had never once considered that the people beneath him might have their own quiet form of strength. He took one look at Ophelia and immediately categorized her, an unknown woman, far too plain in appearance, too bold in her presence. He would teach her her place. "Good afternoon, Mr. Howard." Ophelia's voice broke through the silent tension in the room. It was soft but unshakable, each word an anchor, calm and certain, drawing the attention of everyone present. She extended her hand, a gesture as familiar as it was required in these rooms. But Lucas didn't move. He looked down at her hand with a dismissive smirk, his gaze flicking briefly to his colleagues, who were watching with varying degrees of curiosity and judgment. Without a moment's hesitation, Lucas folded his arms and leaned back, his body language a clear signal of disdain. "I don't shake hands with subordinates," he said, the words sharp and cold, as though they were a foregone conclusion. A heavy silence fell over the room, quite thick with the collective breath of a dozen men, who suddenly realized that the woman in front of them was not the meek subject they had assumed her to be. Ophelia didn't flinch. She didn't pause. She simply withdrew her hand with the grace of someone who had heard those words countless times before. And with a gaze that met Lucas's directly, steady and unwavering, she responded, her tone even but unmistakably commanding. "I'm not your subordinate, Mr. Howard." The words hung in the air like a challenge, like a gauntlet thrown at the feet of a man who had grown used to wielding his power effortlessly, unchallenged. Lucas laughed then, a sharp, mirthless laugh, a laugh that seemed to echo in the sterile, polished confines of the boardroom. "Then what role do you claim here at our company?" he sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. The executives around him chuckled, their laughter thick with superiority, though it was strained. They weren't quite sure how to navigate this unexpected. Ophelia stood unmoved, her expression as cool and unreadable as the stone walls of the room. She was not fazed, not bothered. This was not her first encounter with arrogance, not even close. She opened her leather portfolio slowly, the sound of the pages turning like the start of a well-rehearsed symphony. "I'm here to decide on the $1 billion investment in Terra Nova," she said, each word deliberate, cutting through the room like a cold gust of wind. The atmosphere shifted in an instant. The chuckles died. The smugness in Lucas's eyes faltered, replaced by something else. Uncertainty, maybe doubt. His gaze flicked quickly to the faces of the men around the table, none of whom seemed to know how to react. $1 billion, the amount hung in the air, weighty and undeniable. It was not something any of them had expected to hear from a woman who, just moments ago, had been the subject of their subtle ridicule. Lucas's smirk faltered, just for a moment, but it was enough. Enough to make him pause, just long enough to realize that this was no ordinary meeting. This woman, this unassuming presence, was not here to play games. She was here to make decisions, the kind of decisions that would reverberate far beyond this room. "Well then," Lucas said, trying to recover his composure. But his words sounded hollow now. "A $1 billion investment? Are you kidding me?" He laughed again, but this time it lacked its previous force, sounding more like a nervous reflex. "No one in their right mind would grant that authority to someone like you." He turned back to his colleagues, seeking confirmation, validation from the men who were supposed to back him. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for Ophelia's next move. She did not disappoint. With a quiet confidence, she closed her portfolio and sat back in her chair, as if everything that had happened so far was of no consequence to her. Her gaze never left Lucas's, never wavered. She was not angry, not even offended. She was simply, quietly, above all of it. She was already playing the long game, and she knew that it would cost them far more than they had bargained for. The board members exchanged glances, unsure of what to do next. Lucas, still not fully grasping the gravity of the situation, pressed on. "Well then," he said with forced bravado, "let's begin the meeting. I'm very curious to see what you've brought us." His voice, though steady, was laced with the tremor of someone who could feel control slipping from his hands. Ophelia didn't respond immediately. She didn't need to. Instead, her eyes drifted toward the large window that overlooked the bustling city below, and she made a quiet, internal promise to herself. She had given them this moment, this chance to show their true colors. She would not act impulsively. She would watch, she would wait. The $1 billion wasn't just a number to her, it was leverage. It was power, and she was about to show them just how wrong they were. The hum of the city outside continued unabated. The company's leadership, still unaware of the weight of their actions, carried on as if nothing had shifted. But the foundations had already been cracked. Lucas, Howard, and Terra Nova had no idea that their fate had already been sealed, not by any single act of malice, but by the small, steady glances of a woman they had underestimated. For a few moments, the room sat in a tense silence. The executives now unsure whether they should continue their charade or shift gears. Lucas Howard, who had prided himself on his ability to dominate a room, was now on the defensive. The game had changed, and he was struggling to catch up. Ophelia remained silent, her calm demeanor infuriating Lucas more than anything else could. He wanted to break her, wanted to see a flicker of discomfort, but she was a stone wall, impenetrable and steadfast. He had underestimated her. In fact, it wasn't just her gender or her race that he had failed to see, but the quiet power she wielded without needing to shout or make a scene. This woman had learned in ways he could never fathom how to command authority without the crutches of arrogance. At Terra Nova's headquarters earlier that morning, Ophelia had already caught the first faint traces of what she would later identify as a deep-rooted corporate culture of arrogance. From the moment she had stepped into the lobby, she had been sized up, assessed, not by her ability or intellect, but by her very appearance. She knew exactly how they would look at her. She had spent years in rooms where the whispers were louder than the words, where her presence was not questioned but merely tolerated as a formality. The young receptionist at Terra Nova had regarded her with the kind of look that said, "You don't belong here." Melissa, the receptionist, had no reason to suspect that Ophelia was anything more than an outsider. She had given Ophelia the kind of look that said, "Oh, are you sure you're in the right place?" "I'm here to see Mr. Lucas Howard," Ophelia had said, her voice unshaken. The room, like the woman herself, was full of quiet certainty. Melissa had blinked, not recognizing the name, and then dismissively had asked, "Are you here for the administrative assistant interview?" Ophelia didn't flinch. She had simply replied, "Oh no, I'm here to meet Mr. Howard at Sharamam. My name is Ophelia Jackson." It was a small detail, a trivial one perhaps, but Ophelia could see it. The surprise, the uncomfortable pause, the recognition of something that Melissa hadn't yet comprehended. The receptionist had checked her screen with an obvious reluctance, and only when Ophelia had repeated her name did Melissa reluctantly acknowledge the appointment, pointing to the corner with a flicker of disdain. "You can wait there," she had said, almost begrudgingly. Ophelia had walked to the corner as directed and sat in one of the hardback chairs. She had no words for it then, but she'd known this was no accident. This was not just her. It was about every woman, every person of color, every individual who had ever been forced to prove their worth before they could even enter a room. It wasn't a mistake, it was a message. And now, as she sat quietly in the corner of that pristine lobby, she could see everything. Every slight, every unconscious bias, on full display. The senior executives who had greeted her with silent judgment weren't so much interested in her credentials or her expertise as they were in the fact that she didn't look the way they expected. She wasn't supposed to belong here. She wasn't supposed to have the authority to challenge them, but she did, and they would learn soon enough that she would not be intimidated by the systems they had so carefully built to keep people like her in their place. Minutes passed. Each one felt heavy with the anticipation of the fight to come. The executives had already shown their cards, and it was clear what they thought of Ophelia. Their laughter, though loud and mocking, was merely a defense mechanism. A feeble attempt to control what they felt slipping from their grasp. This wasn't about the money, not anymore. It had never been about the money for Ophelia. This was about something far more important: respect. The clock ticked away with methodical precision as Lucas Howard, oblivious to the storm brewing around him, continued to ramble about Terra Nova's so-called achievements. But Ophelia didn't need to listen to him anymore. The truth was already clear to her. This was a company rotting at its core, and its leadership was the very embodiment of everything wrong with corporate America. She wasn't just here for the investment, she was here to send a message. She was here to expose them for what they were: arrogant, toxic, and blind to the very values that kept them in power. Her gaze drifted slowly across the room, taking in every detail: the glossy table, The expensive chairs, the smug faces of men who thought they were untouchable. They were all playing a game, but it was a game she had already won. And as she sat there, poised and quiet, something remarkable began to happen. Lucas Howard, the man who had so confidently dismissed her, began to feel the weight of his own arrogance. It was subtle at first. A glance at her, a shift in his posture, a slight hesitation in his words. Ophelia wasn't intimidated. She wasn't here to convince him. She wasn't here to beg for anything. She was simply here to see how long it would take before he realized that the power he held was nothing more than a mirage, a delicate illusion of control. Ophelia Jackson was the kind of person who, when they entered a room, didn't need to speak to make themselves heard. She was the kind of woman who understood that power didn't lie in the things you owned, but in the things you could let go of. The moment Lucas had refused her handshake, he had sealed his own fate. The world they had built, their fragile fortress of money and privilege, was about to crumble. Not because Ophelia was fighting against them, but because she had learned how to walk away from them without ever looking back. The moment had arrived. The boardroom, now a battleground, would soon become a stage for a far greater lesson, one that Lucas Howard and the other executives would not soon forget. The silence in the room grew heavier with each passing second, the weight of unspoken words pressing down on all of them. Lucas Howard tried to regain some semblance of control, but it was clear that the ground beneath his feet was shifting, and his attempts to steady himself only made him seem more desperate. His words, once dripping with the ease of power, now felt hollow and strained, as if he could no longer convince anyone, least of all himself, that he was in charge. He leaned forward, trying to reclaim the room, his gaze fixed on Ophelia with renewed determination. But she didn't flinch. It wasn't that she had no emotions. Far from it. The truth was, Ophelia was a woman who had mastered the art of feeling deeply, of understanding the profound weight of every moment. But she also understood that there was power in silence, truth in allowing others to reveal themselves. Lucas, for all his bravado, was unraveling before her eyes. He didn't know it yet, but he had already lost. The moment he dismissed her with that flippant refusal to shake hands, he had unknowingly set the stage for his own downfall. "Let's begin the meeting," Lucas finally said, though his words carried no weight. It was the kind of invitation that tried to cover a crack in the foundation, a futile attempt to regain control of a situation that was slipping out of his hands. He gestured for the meeting to continue. But Ophelia didn't follow. She remained still, poised in her chair, her gaze unwavering as she took in the men around the table, their uneasy glances flickering between her and Lucas. Ophelia wasn't here to entertain them. She wasn't here to play by their rules. She had already made her decision, and now she would simply watch them expose themselves. She knew exactly what they were. Men with fragile egos who had hidden behind their positions for far too long. This was no longer a negotiation. It was a reckoning. As Lucas continued to speak, his words blending into the background, Ophelia allowed herself to drift into her thoughts. She wasn't listening to his sales pitch about Terranova's latest product developments or its so-called breakthroughs in technology. She had already seen enough. The truth had been laid bare the moment she entered the building. The contempt in the receptionist's eyes, the subtle dismissals, the veiled judgments. It all pointed to something deeper, something more toxic than any financial. Terranova wasn't just a company struggling with numbers. It was a company suffering from the rot of its own culture. It was a culture of arrogance, of discrimination, of those who had climbed to the top by stepping on the very people they now deemed unworthy of even a simple handshake. Lucas, with his condescending tone and dismissive attitude, had embodied that culture. But now, in the presence of someone who had no need to prove her worth, who wasn't intimidated by his position, the cracks in the foundation were starting to show. She could feel it, his discomfort, his hesitation, his need to regain control. It was all so palpable, so desperate. And yet Ophelia remained calm, watching him with a serene gaze, as though she were studying a broken man who still didn't understand the extent of his own downfall. As the minutes ticked by, the room grew heavier. The other executives, still holding their silence, exchanged glances, unsure of how to proceed. They weren't sure if they were waiting for Lucas to regain his footing, or if they were simply afraid of what Ophelia might do next. But Ophelia didn't need to do anything. She had already done enough. She had made her presence felt in a way that no one could ignore. And she had already made her decision. The $1 billion investment was no longer about money. It was a statement. It was a chance to reshape the narrative, to bring a company like Terra Nova to its knees and watch it rise, not on the basis of greed and arrogance, but on respect and integrity. Mr. Howard, Ophelia spoke, her voice cutting through the tension in the room like a blade. Lucas froze, his eyes locking onto hers. There was no anger in her tone, no bitterness. Just a calm, unshakable certainty. "You seem to have misunderstood my role here," she said softly. But the weight of her words hung heavy. "I'm not here to listen to your pitch. I'm here to decide whether or not Terra Nova is worthy of the $1 billion investment you so desperately need. And I'll make that decision based on more than just your products. I'll make it based on the culture you've built here, the values you embody, and how you treat the people around you." The room went still. No one moved, no one breathed. Lucas, still trying to mask his growing discomfort with forced confidence, opened his mouth to respond, but the words never came. Ophelia's gaze held him, steady and unyielding, as if she could see right through him. He could feel it, an overwhelming sense of vulnerability, something he had never allowed himself to experience in all his years at the top. A moment passed, and Lucas's bravado began to crumble. He forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. He knew he was losing control. His foundation was cracking beneath him, and for the first time, he was beginning to realize that Ophelia wasn't just a woman to be dismissed. She was a force to be reckoned with. "Are you telling me," Lucas began, his voice faltering slightly, that you will pull your $1 billion investment because of... "What? Because I refuse to shake your hand?" He tried to mask the anxiety creeping into his voice with a chuckle, but it sounded hollow, rehearsed. Ophelia didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. "It's not about the handshake," she replied quietly. "It's about the arrogance behind it. It's about the belief that you can dismiss people because of the color of their skin, right? Because of their gender, because they don't fit your idea of who deserves respect." Her words were sharp now, each one cutting through the room, each one exposing the rot that had long been hidden beneath Terra Nova's glossy exterior. "You think you can buy respect with money, Lucas," Ophelia continued, her gaze unwavering. "But respect is not something you can purchase. It's earned. And right now, Terra Nova has done nothing to earn it." Lucas's face flushed with frustration, but he didn't respond. Charmingly, he could. Every word Ophelia spoke was a reflection of everything he had failed to see, everything he had refused to acknowledge. The room was still. The tension had reached a breaking point. Lucas, once the embodiment of power and control, was now the one standing at the precipice, unable to move, unable to speak, his pride and arrogance crumbling in front of the very woman he had dismissed. Ophelia closed her portfolio slowly, the sound of the leather closing like a final judgment. She didn't need to say more. The decision was already made. And Terra Nova, for all its wealth and power, was about to pay the price for its own hubris. The hum of the city outside continued, oblivious to the drama unfolding within Terra Nova's boardroom. Cars sped by, each one carrying people to places they believed mattered. But here, in this room, the stakes were far higher than any of them realized. Ophelia Jackson wasn't simply making a business decision. She was rewriting the rules, not for herself, but for an entire system that had long been broken. Lucas Howard's world, the world of power, arrogance, and unchecked authority, was crumbling with every moment of silence that passed. Lucas, still standing behind his chair, blinked rapidly, his mind scrambling to regain control. He had spent years climbing, elbowing his way to the top, building an empire on the backs of those who weren't fortunate enough to sit at the table. He had never considered that someone like Ophelia, someone who didn't fit his image of success, could have the power to bring it all crashing down. Yet here she was, cool and composed, unwavering in her belief that respect could not be bought or manipulated. She was right, of course. Lucas knew it in his gut, but he refused to admit it. He couldn't afford to. To acknowledge the truth would mean accepting the fragility of everything he had worked for. He had been raised in a world where power was wielded like a weapon, where status and wealth were the only currencies that mattered. He had never considered that there was another way, a way where people like Ophelia had a voice, and where integrity outweighed greed. Still, the words caught in his throat. He could not speak them, even as they rang in his mind. He had underestimated her, and now his empire was crumbling beneath the weight of his own arrogance. But he was not a man to go down quietly. He would fight. He would find a way to reclaim control. But Ophelia wasn't interested in his fight. She had already won. The boardroom was hers, as much as the streets outside belonged to the city. She had walked in, without fanfare, without hesitation, and had already decided how this story would end. There was no more need for pleasantries, no more need for a game of politeness. Ophelia closed her eyes briefly, as if allowing the full weight of the moment to wash over her, then opened them again, locking eyes with Lucas. "You will get your answer today," she said simply. Her voice was calm, but the authority in it was undeniable. The finality of her statement hung in the air, thick and palpable. The men around the table shifted in their seats, each of them squirming under the pressure, unable to fully grasp what had just happened. They had come into this meeting believing that they held the power, that they controlled the narrative. But Ophelia had already turned the tables, and they were left playing catch-up. Lucas, desperate to salvage whatever shred of dignity he had left, opened his mouth again. "This isn't how things work, Ophelia," he said, his voice tinged with frustration. "You don't understand the way the world works. You think you can come in here and make demands without understanding the consequences?" Ophelia's expression remained unchanged, as if she were watching a child try to grasp the concept of a game they had no chance of winning. She folded her arms slowly, her eyes still fixed on Lucas. "I understand perfectly well, Lucas," she replied, her voice steady and sure. "What I understand is that people like you have spent far too long believing that you are invincible, that your arrogance will carry you through every situation. What I understand is that you think your position, your wealth, your status will protect you from the consequences of your actions. Lucas recoiled at her words, the weight of them settling like a stone in his stomach. He had never been spoken to like this. Never had someone stand before him so completely unimpressed by his position. He had always been the one who did the humiliating. He had always been the one to hold the power. And now here she was, in front of him, calmly holding up a mirror to his face. She was not angry, not shouting, not demanding. She was simply, undeniably, right. The realization hit him harder than any attack ever could. He had spent so long building walls, so long protecting himself with the armor of privilege, that he had never once considered what it would be like if someone tore it all down. The other executives in the room remained silent, unwilling to interject. They were like spectators at a play they didn't fully understand, right? Unsure whether they should clap or walk out. Some of them looked at Lucas, waiting for him to make a comeback. Oh! But the fire that once burned in his eyes had dimmed, quite replaced by a flicker of doubt. He was cornered, not just by Ophelia, but by his own actions. He had tried to tear her down, to belittle her, to make her feel small. And yet, here she was, unshaken, untouched by the weight of his words, and holding the very power he had sought for so long. She wasn't just a woman, she wasn't just an outsider, she was a force to be reckoned with. Ophelia stood up from her chair slowly, deliberately. Her eyes never left Lucas's. She was not in a rush. She had time. Time to let the reality of this moment settle over everyone in the room. To let them understand what had just happened. Lucas's empire was crumbling, not because Ophelia had come in with a hammer and torn it apart, but because she had stood there with the calm of someone who knew the truth, who had nothing left to prove. "You'll get your answer soon enough, Lucas," she said softly, her voice like silk over steel. She turned then, walking toward the door with the same unhurried grace she had entered with. As she opened the door, she paused, looking back at him one final time. "And when it comes, I hope you'll be ready to face the consequences of your own choices." The room was still, and for the first time, Lucas Howard felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. It was not the weight of power, nor the weight of wealth. It was the weight of his own pride and arrogance, and it was crushing him. Ophelia walked out, leaving the men in that room to stew in the aftermath of the storm she had just unleashed. The door clicked shut behind her, and the silence that followed was profound. No one spoke, no one moved. They had just witnessed something far greater than a simple business negotiation. They had witnessed the end of an era. Outside the room, the world continued on its steady course. People walked down the streets, cars passed with indifferent speed, and the sky stretched above, endless and unmoved by the drama unfolding within Terra Nova's walls. But for those who had witnessed the exchange, the air seemed to thicken, as if the very molecules had rearranged themselves into something new, something that would never return to the way it had been before Ophelia Jackson walked into that room. It was an odd thing, Lucas thought. He had spent so much of his life building his empire, cultivating his image as the unshakable leader, the powerful CEO who had made it all, who had faced every challenge with a sneer and a raised chin. But now, in the aftermath of the meeting, he was left feeling smaller than he ever had. Not just physically, though his posture was hunched and his shoulders tight with tension. No, it was something deeper, something psychological, something that cut at the very core of his being. He had never expected Ophelia to stand her ground. He had dismissed her so quickly, so easily, thinking that she, like so many others, would crumble under the weight of his authority. But she hadn't. In fact, she had done the opposite. She had exposed him, not just to the room, but to himself. Lucas Howard had lived for decades surrounded by a fortress of privilege and entitlement. His wealth, his position, and his race had shielded him from any real consequences. People had whispered behind his back, but they had never dared to challenge him to his face, until now. Until Ophelia, his thoughts spiraled, tumbling through the endless loop of what-ifs. What if he had been more gracious? What if he had tried to understand her instead of assuming? What if he hadn't dismissed her from the moment she stepped into the room? It was too late for what-ifs now. What was done, and he had shown the world exactly who he was. Lucas's eyes shifted to the door, as if expecting Ophelia to walk back in, to finish what she had started. But she didn't. She was gone. And the room, which had been filled with tension only moments ago, now seemed too quiet, too empty. It wasn't the silence of peace. No, this was the silence of something irreparable, something broken beyond repair. Back at her office at Jackson Capital Partners, Ophelia sat before her desk, fingers lightly resting on the polished wood. Her expression was unreadable, but inside she felt a quiet satisfaction. Not a triumph, but a deep, unshakable certainty that what had just happened was necessary. Not just for her, but for the world around her. The investors, the executives, the board members, they were all part of a system that had allowed the Lucas Howards of the world to thrive, unchecked for far too long. They had created a culture where arrogance and bigotry were not only tolerated, but rewarded. And Ophelia had just shown them that it didn't have to be that way. She reached for her phone, her fingers brushing lightly over the screen. A quick message typed with deliberate care, execute. The word was simple, but it held so much power. To the untrained eye, it might have seemed like just another instruction. But to those who knew Ophelia, it was a signal, a command. A decision that would reverberate through the markets, through the very foundation of Terra Nova. In another part of the city, Daniel Anderson, Ophelia's trusted CFO, sat at his desk reviewing market trends, when his phone buzzed. He glanced at the message and, without hesitation, rose from his chair. He knew exactly what needed to be done. Ophelia had spoken, and it was time to set the plan in motion. The wheels of the financial world, often slow and ponderous, now moved with ruthless efficiency. Daniel quickly made a series of calls, each one more precise than the last. Analysts were briefed, instructions were given, and before long, the first wave of sell orders began to ripple through the market. It wasn't dramatic at first, just a slight dip in the price of Terra Nova's stock, a minor fluctuation. But it was enough to catch the eye of major investors who, unsure of what was happening, began to pull back. Slowly, the floodgates opened and the stock began its sharp descent. Lucas had no idea what was happening. He sat in his office, staring at the glowing red numbers on his screen as they fluctuated wildly. His stomach churned as the value of Terra Nova began to plummet. What the hell was going on? He grabbed the phone and called his assistant, "Get me the board, now." But the calls were futile. By the time the executives gathered in the conference room, the damage had already been done. Terra Nova's stock had fallen by nearly Biffinger in a matter of minutes, and the whispers had started. Analysts were beginning to talk, and the world was listening. News outlets began running reports about a potential scandal at Terra Nova, citing internal leadership issues and cultural concerns. It was only a matter of time before the entire truth came to light. Meanwhile, back at Jackson Capital, Ophelia watched the drama unfold with a sense of calm detachment. This was what she had been waiting for. This was the power of exposure. Not the kind that came from public confrontation. No, not the kind that burned bridges. No, Ophelia was far more subtle than that. She understood that real power came from being a step ahead, from controlling the narrative before it even began. As the sell-offs continued, the pressure mounted. Investors began to question Terra Nova's leadership, and their doubts spread like wildfire. But Ophelia remained unmoved. She had already made her decision. The $1 billion wasn't just about money anymore. It was about exposing the very foundation of a toxic corporate culture, about showing the world that this kind of arrogance, this kind of prejudice, could not be allowed to stand. In that quiet office, Ophelia leaned back in her chair and allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile. This was the kind of change that would echo for years. The kind of change that would shape the future, not just of Terra Nova, but of every company that ever thought it could operate without consequence. She closed her eyes for a moment, as the sounds of the outside world, the clattering of keyboards, the hum of the city drifted away. There was nothing to do now but wait. The storm had begun, and there was no turning back. Lucas Howard's office had never seemed so small, so suffocating. The walls, once a symbol of his control, now pressed in around him, each corner echoing with the loss of power that he could no longer deny. His phone rang incessantly, the shrill sound cutting through the thick silence. But each time he reached for it, the call would end before he could answer. His assistant had come and gone, only offering hurried apologies for the barrage of incoming calls. Calls from shareholders, from journalists, from board members demanding answers. His mind raced, jumping from one possible explanation to the next. But none seemed to make sense. How could this happen so quickly? How could his empire, built on years of careful maneuvering, come crashing down in mere minutes? The stock had plummeted, yes, but why? Why now? He knew the answer before he even finished the thought. Ophelia Jackson, she had done this. She had executed her plan with such quiet precision, with such calculated silence, that it felt like a storm had descended without warning. And all he could do now was sit in the wreckage of his own making. The words she had spoken to him in the boardroom echoed in his mind. Prent. I'm here to decide on the $1 billion investment in Terra Nova. And I'll make that decision based on more than just your products. I'll make it based on the culture you've built here, the values you embody, and how you treat the people around you. Ophelia had been more than just a threat to him. She had been a mirror, holding up a reflection he was too blind to see. It wasn't just the small affronts, the refusal to shake hands, the dismissive comments. It was everything. The arrogance, the entitlement, the toxic culture that had permeated Terra Nova from the top down. He ran a hand over his face, feeling the weight of his own disgrace. His mind replayed the morning's events in a cycle, the conversations, the meetings, the glances from his colleagues. No one had said anything outright, but he knew the truth. They had all seen it. They had all watched him expose his weakness, his inability to maintain control when faced with someone who refused to be intimidated. Mr. Howard, a voice broke through his thoughts, and he turned to see Julia standing in the doorway, her face pale and nervous. The board, they want to speak with you. The words felt like a death sentence. The board, The men and women who had once looked to him as their leader, their guiding force, were now demanding answers, their patience worn thin by the ongoing market instability and the mounting pressure from shareholders. He had known this moment would come, but he had never imagined it would feel like this, like the final breath of his career, slipping away with every passing second. Lucas stood, his legs shaky, his mind clouded with the haze of his own failure. He walked slowly to the conference room, each step heavy with the weight of what was about to unfold. The door opened, and he was greeted by the cold, expectant gazes of the board members. Robert Butler, the chairman, stood at the head of the table, his expression grave. There was no warmth in his eyes, no recognition of the man Lucas once was. Only the cold, calculated judgment of a failure, Lucas, Butler said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. The board has made its decision. You're suspended as CEO effective immediately. The words hit Lucas like a physical blow. He opened his mouth to protest, to argue, but the words wouldn't come. There was no point in fighting. It was done. His arrogance, his belief that he was untouchable, had finally caught up with him. We'll be launching an independent investigation, Butler continued, his tone unyielding. We need to examine the allegations against you, as well as the corporate culture you've fostered here at Terra Nova. This cannot go on. Lucas felt the blood drain from his face. He had built this company from the ground up. He had fought for every inch of progress, every accolade. And now, in an instant, it was slipping through his fingers. The weight of the board's gaze was suffocating. They weren't looking at him like they once had, with respect or admiration. They were looking at him like a man who had failed them. A man who had squandered the very thing that had made Terra Nova great. Robert Lucas managed to choke out, his voice cracking. You can't do this. I built this company. I brought it to where it is today. No, Butler interrupted sharply, his eyes flashing with disdain. You didn't build anything, Lucas. You manipulated. You bullied. You allowed this toxic culture to fester. And now it's coming back to bite us. We can't afford to ignore it any longer. The words cut deeper than Lucas had anticipated. He had always prided himself on his ability to control the narrative, to shape the world around him. But now that control had been taken from him, stripped away by the very culture he had helped create. His failure wasn't just a personal one. It was systemic, and it was unraveling before his eyes. Lucas tried to speak again, but this time no words came. He could feel his world crumbling piece by piece, as the board members stood in silence, their eyes a mixture of disappointment and anger. No one said anything more. The decision had been made, and the consequences were clear. Outside the conference room, the hallways of Terra Nova felt eerily quiet. The usual hustle and bustle of the office had ceased, replaced by an oppressive stillness that seemed to hang in the air. Lucas walked slowly back to his office, his footsteps heavy with the realization that everything he had worked for, everything he had built, was now in jeopardy. The world outside had moved on. Investors were pulling their money out. The media was already running the story. And all Lucas could do now was watch as it all fell apart. He sat at his desk, staring at the screen in front of him. The numbers on the stock ticker blinked relentlessly, a reminder of the disaster unfolding before him. He wanted to pick up the phone, to call someone, to do something, but he knew it was too late. He had crossed a line, and now there was no going back. And all the while, Ophelia Jackson, calm, composed, and unmoved, was watching it unfold from the sidelines. She had made her decision, and it was a decision that would change everything. The events were moving with the velocity of a freight train, and Lucas Howard could only watch as everything he had spent a lifetime building disintegrated before him. The weight of his failure, The realization that he was the architect of his own destruction sank into his bones with a slow, relentless pressure. There was no escaping it. The collapse was not just financial, it was personal. It was his pride, his arrogance, his years of blind belief in his own invincibility that had led him here. And now, as the world outside continued to turn, he sat frozen in his office, the room around him feeling smaller with each passing minute. He had thought himself untouchable, great, a man who could play with the lives of others, build empires on their backs, and then walk away unscathed. But the universe had a way of correcting itself. Ophelia Jackson had not just come into his boardroom to challenge him. She had come to hold a mirror up to everything he had ignored, everything he had taken for granted. And what she showed him wasn't just his failure, it was the failure of everything he had built. It was only a matter of time before the next wave of repercussions came crashing down. The stock continued to plummet. Terra Nova's reputation, so carefully curated by Lucas's hand, had already begun to shatter. The whispers had started, and now the questions were turning into demands. People were asking how they had missed the signs, how they had allowed this kind of toxic culture to thrive for so long. Investors were pulling back in droves, watching from the sidelines as the ship Lucas had captained began to sink. And still, Ophelia Jackson was watching. She had never been loud. She had never been the kind of person to seek attention or validation. But in her quiet, calm way, she had been a force of nature. Lucas had thought himself the storm, the hurricane that could level everything in its path. But Ophelia had been the calm before that storm. She had observed, waited, and then struck with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. She wasn't in a hurry. She didn't need to prove anything. The only thing she needed was for the world to see Terra Nova for what it truly was. Ophelia had never wanted to be the villain in someone's story. She had never sought the spotlight or the drama, but in this moment she was forced into it. She was the one who would reshape this narrative, the one who would turn the tide and expose the reality of what had been hidden beneath the glossy exterior of corporate success. She didn't need to throw punches or make grand speeches. She just needed to show up. And that was what she had done. Her phone buzzed quietly on her desk, and she picked it up without a second thought. Daniel Anderson's name flashed across the screen. She tapped the screen to answer, her gaze still fixed on the screen in front of her. She had already made her decision, and now it was time to let it unfold. Phase 1 complete, Daniel's voice came through, calm but carrying the weight of the storm that had been unleashed. The stocks down by Fenjer in the last hour. We're seeing the effects across the board. Analysts are already flagging concerns about Terra Nova's leadership. Ophelia didn't need any further details. She had already seen the writing on the wall. The damage was done. Terra Nova was bleeding, and Lucas Howard's empire was crumbling from within. "I know," Ophelia replied softly. "Let it play out. I'm not in a hurry." Daniel was quiet for a moment, as if processing the enormity of what had just happened. Ophelia had been calm throughout the entire process. Daniel knew her better than anyone. She wasn't indifferent. She was calculating. She had been playing a long game. "You're sure about this?" Daniel asked. "You?" His voice tinged with a mix of admiration and concern. Ophelia paused for a moment before responding. "This isn't about being sure, Daniel. It's about doing what's right. I don't care if they hate me for it. I care if they learn from it. If Terra Nova and the rest of them continue to operate like this, then nothing will change. I'm not here to be their friend. I'm here to show them what real power looks like. And they'll learn, whether they want to or not." Daniel didn't respond immediately. Instead, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. Ophelia could almost hear him nodding in silent agreement. He had known her for long enough to understand that when she made a decision, it was final. There was no wavering, no second-guessing. She had a vision, and she would see it through. "I'll keep you posted on the market," Daniel finally said. "We'll continue to monitor the situation and be ready for anything good," Ophelia replied. "We'll need to stay ahead of it. Let's make sure this doesn't just stop at Terra Nova. Our system needs to change." She hung up the phone and leaned back in her chair, her eyes scanning the window that overlooked the bustling city below. She had done what she came here to do. Now it was in the hands of the world. Back at Terra Nova, the storm was just beginning. The board had convened, their faces grim and tight with uncertainty. Robert Butler, the chairman, had called the emergency meeting. Lucas Howard, still recovering from the shock of his suspension, sat quietly at the back of the room, trying to suppress the bitter taste of defeat that lingered in his mouth. The boardroom had been his domain for so long, a place where he had held absolute authority. But now as he sat there, he could feel the eyes of the board members on him, their judgment clear in the silence between them. They were waiting for him to say something, to offer some kind of explanation. But Lucas had nothing left to offer. He had built this company on his terms, and now those terms had come back to haunt him. Robert Butler stood at the head of the table, quiet, his face impassive as he addressed the group. "We need to act swiftly," he said, his voice firm. "The damage is already done. Ophelia Jackson's actions have set off a chain reaction. We're losing investors, and our reputation is in freefall. We need a plan." Now there was no dissent in the room. No one argued with Butler. The truth had become undeniable. The storm had arrived, and it was far more powerful than anyone had anticipated. Lucas's mind raced. He had been blindsided, and now he could only watch as the company he had built teetered on the edge of collapse. There was no escaping it. The consequences of his arrogance were now in full view. But even as the meeting continued, Lucas couldn't help but feel a strange sense of clarity. He had spent his entire life fighting to maintain control, to keep everything in line, to make the world bend to his will. But it had all come crashing down with one simple moment. One misstep, one dismissive word, and everything he had worked for was gone. Ophelia Jackson had shown him what true power looked like, and now, for the first time, Lucas understood that it wasn't about control. It was about respect, and respect, as he was learning the hard way, couldn't be bought. It had to be earned. Lucas Howard sat in the boardroom, his mind numb with disbelief. The conversation around him seemed distant, as though he were submerged underwater. Listening to the muffled voices of those who once revered him now speak with thinly veiled contempt. Robert Butler and the other board members were speaking in circles, discussing damage control, shareholder meetings, and emergency press releases. But Lucas's thoughts were far away, his mind replaying every moment of the last few hours. The moment Ophelia Jackson had walked into the room, he had known something would change. At first, he thought it would be something small, something inconsequential. Maybe she would be a blip, a woman who wouldn't last long in the cutthroat world of high finance. But the cold reality of her power had struck him like a thunderclap. She was not here to negotiate. She was here to rewrite the rules, and Lucas, for all his years of experience, had not seen it coming. He hadn't believed her when she had said she would decide on Terra Nova's future. Not based on numbers or products, but on the company's culture. He had laughed it off, certain that his wealth, his position, his reputation, those would be enough to win her over. But the truth, now stark and undeniable, was that Ophelia had seen through everything. She had seen the rot beneath the glossy surface of Terra Nova, the systemic issues that Lucas had ignored for so long. She had been unshaken by his insults, by his dismissal. She had already made up her mind. And Lucas? He had played right into her hands. As Robert Butler continued to speak, Lucas felt an overwhelming sense of helplessness wash over him. He had spent decades shaping his life around the assumption that power was something to be seized, that respect could be purchased, that success was measured in assets, stock prices, and influence. But the respect Ophelia commanded, without needing to demand it, without needing to raise her voice or lower her head, had cut through him with surgical precision. She hadn't needed to say much. She hadn't needed to fight him. She had simply shown him his own reflection. Butler's voice broke through Lucas's spiraling thoughts. "We need a strategy," Robert was saying. "We've lost the $1 billion investment. Investors are pulling back. We're hemorrhaging value by the minute. What's our next move?" For the first time in the meeting, Lucas's voice broke through the silence. "What do you want me to say, Robert?" His words were harsh, tinged with frustration and regret. "You've already made up your minds. I'm out. There's nothing left for me here." The room fell silent at his admission. Lucas had never been a man to admit defeat so easily. But today he felt the weight of it, felt it in his bones, in his gut, in every fiber of his being. He had built his empire on the idea that he could control everything. But control, it seemed, was an illusion. Robert studied him for a long moment, his face unreadable. "Lucas, the board has decided to suspend you. The investigation will move forward, and you will not be involved in any decisions until further notice. We're appointing Paul White as acting CEO. She will guide us through the immediate crisis." Paul White. Lucas hadn't expected that. Paul had been with the company for years, but she had always been one of the quieter ones, less interested in the spotlight. She had never shown any ambition for the top spot. And yet here she was, the one the board was turning to for leadership in his place. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but what choice did he have? None, really. He had lost all. Not just the job, not just the company. He had lost the respect of everyone in that room, and worse still, the respect of the world that had once admired him. "I understand," Lucas finally muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "I'll step aside. I don't have a choice." Butler gave a sharp nod, then turned to the rest of the board members. "We'll move quickly. The media is already picking up on the crisis, and we need to be transparent about what happened. We have to move forward, and we have to do it quickly. Our credibility depends on it." Lucas stood up, the motion slow, almost mechanical. His body felt foreign to him, like a suit he no longer fit into. He had once been the master of this room, the man who decided the fate of others with a glance or a single word. Now he was nothing more than a bystander in his own story. "Paul," Lucas said, his voice barely audible as he turned to face her, I hope you do what's best for this company." Paul gave him a tight professional smile, but there was something in her eyes, something that Lucas couldn't quite place. It wasn't sympathy, it wasn't warmth, it was understanding. She understood, as he did now, that this was the end of an era, and that perhaps this was the beginning of something else. He walked out of the boardroom, the heavy silence of the hallways, pressing in on him like a weight. The world outside was still the same, the sun still shining, the traffic still buzzing along. But for Lucas, everything had changed. His name would soon be forgotten, his legacy reduced to a cautionary tale. As Lucas made his way down the corridor, he thought of Ophelia again. The way she had stood before him, so calm, so collected, so in control. He had wanted to break her, to see her stumble under the weight of his superiority. But instead, she had broken him. Without raising a hand, without even making a sound, she had torn down everything he had built. In that moment, Lucas realized something he had never understood before. Turtis' power didn't come from taking control of others. It didn't come from wealth or status or influence. Teslic's power came from within, from knowing your worth and standing firm in that knowledge, regardless of what the world thought of you. Ophelia had shown him that. As he left the building, his heart heavy with the realization of his own downfall, Lucas Howard understood that it wasn't the market, it wasn't Ophelia, it wasn't the investors who had taken everything from him. It was his own choices, the arrogance, the pride, the refusal to see beyond his own narrow vision. And in that painful, quiet moment, Lucas Howard learned what it meant to lose everything. Not just his position, but his identity. The city outside Terra Nova's headquarters felt as though it had never noticed the tremor that had just shaken the building. The streets were still bustling, filled with people walking briskly, eyes fixed ahead, oblivious to the seismic shift that had just occurred inside those polished walls. For most of them, this was just another day. Another day of the endless grind, the cycle of work, the pursuit of more, always more. They walked by, heads down, moving past the glass and steel that housed the powerful, never knowing what had just been destroyed or who had done it. Lucas Howard was no longer part of that world. He had been cast out, removed from the throne he had so meticulously built for himself. And now, as he walked alone down the hallway toward the elevator, he could feel the distance between himself and the life he had known growing wider with every step. The man who had once been untouchable, who had held the reins of Terra Nova in a vice grip, was now just another forgotten face in a sea of faceless people. He had worked tirelessly to build his empire, convincing himself that his wealth, his influence, would shield him from the consequences of his actions. He had believed that he could be both the architect and the destroyer of his own destiny. And for a time it had worked, but that illusion had shattered today. In that boardroom, with every word Ophelia Jackson had spoken, the world he had so carefully crafted had collapsed. And he had watched it happen, powerless to stop it. But it wasn't just his empire that was crumbling. It was him. Lucas Howard, the man who had built himself from nothing, had finally realized that what he had built wasn't real. His wealth had been real, yes, but his power, his influence, those were fragile constructs, fragile as glass. And glass, when shattered, left nothing but jagged edges. He stood still for a moment in the elevator lobby, staring out the windows at the world beyond. The streets of the city, with their constant motion, seemed so distant now. He had been part of that world once, a man who mattered, a man who shaped the course of events. But now he was an outsider. His reflection in the glass, staring back at him, was not the reflection of the man he once thought he was, but the man he had become. A failure, a casualty of his own arrogance. The elevator doors opened and Lucas stepped inside. The quiet hum of the elevator felt like a mockery to him, the stillness inside the sleek, polished box reminding him of how empty his life had become. He pressed the button for the ground floor, not caring about the ride, not caring about the destination. He was beyond that now. There was nowhere left to go, and even if there was, he wasn't sure he could bear to face it. As the elevator descended, Lucas thought back on the events of the day, replaying them again and again in his mind. The moments in the boardroom, Ophelia's steady gaze, the way her calmness had exposed his chaos. The realization had been swift, like a knife cutting through the fog of his own delusions. Ophelia wasn't the threat he had thought her to be. She was the reckoning, the inevitable force that had come to collect the debt he had owed for so long. And now it was too late to pay it back. The elevator reached the ground floor, and the doors slid open with a soft whoosh. Lucas stepped out and walked across the lobby, his head bowed, his footsteps heavier than they had ever been. He passed the receptionist who had once given him that dismissive glance when Ophelia had arrived. She didn't look at him now as if he were no longer worth acknowledging. It was a small thing, but it stung all the same, another reminder of how far he had fallen. Outside, the city continued its dance, oblivious to the man who had just been cast aside. Lucas walked into the street, his head still down, not looking at the bustling life around him. The weight of his own failure clung to him like a shroud. He had once believed he could change the world with his money and his power. But now he realized that the world had a way of changing people who believed in that kind of control. He made his way through the crowd, a ghost among the living. The people around him, so sure of their own places in the world, seemed to move with a kind of rhythm, as though they knew exactly where they were going. Lucas had once been part of that rhythm, had once danced to the beat of his own ambition. But now he was out of step, the music had stopped, and Lucas was left behind. As he walked, the silence of his own thoughts seemed to grow louder. He couldn't escape it. The questions, the regrets, the doubts, they swirled inside his mind, biting at him, gnawing at him like 1,000 rats in the dark. What had he done? What had he become? Was it worth it? The truth, he knew, was that it had never been about power. Not really. Power had been the illusion. The true pursuit had always been something else, something deeper, something more insidious. It had been about validation, about proving to himself and to the world that he was worthy, that he mattered, that he could stand tall among the giants. And now, standing in the middle of the city, watching the world continue on without him, Lucas understood for the first time that all the money, all the power, all the status in the world could never fill that. It wasn't about being seen by others. It was about seeing himself. It was about realizing that true worth didn't come from what he owned or who he controlled. It came from within. For the first time in his life, Lucas felt the weight of his own humanity, the weight of his imperfections, his flaws, his brokenness. He wasn't invincible. He wasn't untouchable. He was just a man like any other, caught in the inevitable tide of his own choices. As he walked, a thought began to form in his mind, a thought that scared him more than anything else. Perhaps, he thought, this wasn't the end. Perhaps in some strange way it was the beginning. He had lost everything, yes, but in losing everything, maybe, just maybe, he could begin to rebuild. Not the empire he had once known, but something else, something real. The first step, Lucas realized, was simple. It was to stop running from himself. It was to accept that he was no longer the man who had walked into the boardroom that morning. He had become something else, something more fragile, more human, and in that fragility there might be a chance for growth. As Lucas Howard continued to walk through the city, the noise of the world around him grew fainter. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel the silence, to embrace it. And in that silence he found something he hadn't known was there: peace. The city never stopped, never hesitated for a moment to acknowledge the seismic shifts that had just taken place. The streets were alive with the ceaseless rhythm of existence, the constant pulse of the machines and the people who operated them. But Lucas Howard, walking down the crowded sidewalk, felt as if he were walking in slow motion, as if the world had pressed the pause button on his life, while everything else continued to move forward. He felt detached from it all, as though he were an observer in a story that no longer involved him. He passed by countless faces, some smiling, some frowning, all seemingly absorbed in their own lives, their own little dramas. No one noticed him. No one stopped to acknowledge the former CEO of Terra Nova, Hino, the man who had once been a symbol of power, of success, of control. He had been a fixture in the business world, a man whose name had carried weight. But now, Lucas was just another face in the crowd, in another nameless figure lost in the endless sea of people. It was a strange sensation, one that was both liberating and suffocating. He had spent so much of his life wanting to be seen, wanting to be noticed, wanting to be admired. But now that he had been stripped of that attention, of that validation, he found himself questioning everything. What had all of it been for? The money, the power, the titles? What had they truly meant in the end? The answers didn't come immediately. Lucas was too clouded with the remnants of his past self, too enmeshed in the legacy of the man he had been. But as he walked through the city, moving from one street to the next, something began to shift within him. The noise of the world, the frantic rush of people who were all striving for something, slowly faded into that. He began to hear his own thoughts more clearly. To hear the quiet hum of his own heart beating, as if for the first time in years. He thought back to the words Ophelia had spoken to him in the boardroom, reddened. Respect is not something you can purchase. It's earned. The irony of it struck him. Here he was, a man who had spent a lifetime trying to buy respect with wealth and power, only to find that the very thing he had sought so desperately was the one thing he had never been able to secure. But Ophelia, in her quiet strength, had not needed to buy it. She had earned it. Earned it not through manipulation or force, but through her integrity, through her unshakable belief in her own worth. She had never needed the approval of anyone in that room, and yet she had commanded more respect than any of them. Lucas paused in the middle of the sidewalk, the weight of the realization pressing down on him. Respect. It wasn't something that could be demanded. It wasn't something that could be won through dominance or control. It was something that grew slowly, steadily, from the ground up. It was something that had to be cultivated from within. He took a deep breath, trying to ground himself in the simplicity of the thought. He wasn't there yet. He wasn't at the point where he could say he had found peace. But he was closer than he had ever been. The road ahead was long, and he knew it wouldn't be easy. The stain of his past, the arrogance that had defined him, would not wash away overnight. But he could start. He could begin to rebuild, not his empire, but himself. He could start by accepting who he was and, more importantly, who he had become. As Lucas continued his walk through the city, he felt the weight of his decisions settle into his bones. There was no going back. The world he had built, the persona he had constructed, was gone. But that wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new chapter. One where he would have to learn how to walk through life without the crutches of his past, without the walls of arrogance and pride that had protected him for so long. And as he walked, he realized that perhaps for the first time in his life, he was truly free. Free from the expectations, free from the judgments, free from the constant need to prove himself. He didn't have to be Lucas Howard, the CEO. He didn't have to be the man who controlled everything and everyone around him. He could simply be Lucas, the man who had made mistakes, but who was willing to face them, to grow from them, to let them go. In the distance he saw a park. The green of the grass seemed inviting, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. The quiet calm of the space, offering a brief respite from the chaos of the city. Lucas walked toward it, his steps lighter now, more purposeful. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't know if he would ever find his way back to a place of success, of influence. But it didn't matter. For the first time, it didn't matter. He was no longer concerned with what others thought of him. He was no longer chasing after validation. He was simply walking one step at a time towards something new. As Lucas sat on a bench in the park, the world around him still moving at its frantic pace, he closed his eyes. He wasn't sure if he would ever be the man he once was, but he didn't need to be. The woman, the boy, the man, the soldier who knows his worth does not chase after money, fame, or choice. He moves in the direction of his own peace, his own truth, without needing the approval of others. And in that he finds freedom. It was a quiet victory, one that no one could take from him. Thank you for following this story on Shoe Stories. If this story moved you, taught you something, or made you reflect on the meaning of silence, please like, subscribe to our channel, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments below the video. Your voice matters. Let it be heard, whether it's in silence or loud, and don't go anywhere. Click on one of the videos displayed on your screen to watch more powerful stories about dignity and unexpected heroes. We'll see you in the next story.